Welcome to the O'Connor Elder Law channel. I'm your host, Melissa O'Connor. I'm a Florida-based elder law attorney who does estate planning, focusing on long-term care needs, commonly referred to as Medicaid planning, and I do probate, and I do it well. Today, I wanted to talk to you about a common Medicaid spin-down strategy, which is the purchase of prepaid funeral expenses, essentially prepaying for your burial and your funeral expenses as a mechanism to spin down some of your excess assets such that you can qualify for Medicaid to help you pay for your long-term care needs, whether they are in-home nursing or nursing home care. Everybody, every single one of us, we are not going to be able to avoid what they say death and taxes, right? So we will all need to be buried or have our remains disposed of. I know it's somewhat morbid to think of, but it is one of those natural processes of life that is an expense that many times can be left to our loved ones to address upon our passing. So it's really helpful to families to have, if their loved one would have pre-planned these funeral expenses and paid for it themselves during their lifetime, such that not only do we have in place their wishes as to what type of viewing or funeral or ceremony they would like to honor their life, but also that the costs involved in that have already been paid and that we don't need to worry about loved ones either setting up GoFundMe pages or rallying all the relatives to chip in for the funeral and burial expenses. And one of the things that Medicaid allows, it allows, and under Florida Medicaid rules, the Medicaid applicant, a person who's going to be applying for Medicaid or a Medicaid recipient, they're allowed to set aside for their funeral expenses $2,000 per person. Excuse me, $2,500 per person. So a couple could set aside $5,000. And this money, as long as it's earmarked for a burial fund or something like that, it could just be, practically speaking, a separate savings account that you label burial fund. And you could have that cash on hand, and it does not count towards the $2,000 that the Medicaid applicant otherwise is only allowed to have to their name, and they could still qualify for Medicaid. But if anybody has paid for a funeral or burial expenses, you know that $2,500 is not going to go far, and that many times funeral and burial expenses well exceed that amount of money. So if you wanted to pay for all of the expenses that are anticipated from, you know, lying yourself to rest, you can prepay and enter into a burial contract or a pre-funeral contract with a funeral home provider. And as long as that contract is irrevocable, meaning you can't get your money back, the Medicaid applicant can't say, I'd like to cash this in and trade it in and get my money back. As long as you can't get your money back, as long as it's irrevocable, that amount will not count as an asset for Medicaid purposes. So in theory, you could have the most elaborate and extraordinary funeral prepaid as long as that contract is irrevocable. You can pick whatever flowers you want. You could have the most ornate ceremony with whatever it is that meets your fancy, certain musical selections or artists performing. But practically speaking, most people don't throw huge parties that they are no longer able to attend. But the concept is that you're able to prepay for a funeral that you deem is appropriate to honor your life. And that, as long as that contract is irrevocable, that would not be considered an asset, and your family members would they would thank you for having made that arrangement in advance, so that way there's one less thing that they have to worry about, and they can simply just mourn your passing at the time that you leave. The other thing that you could do if you were looking to apply for Medicaid and you thought you had to spend down some of your monies is you can also, besides prepaying for your own funeral, you can also prepay for family members. So if you have a section, a plot, where you want all your relatives to, you and your children, and to be buried, you can prepay for those opening and closing expenses, headstones, things of that nature. If it's a crypt, you could prepay again at opening, closing type costs. And as long as they are considered an immediate family member under the Medicaid rules and the contract is irrevocable, you can prepay for your entire family's funeral expenses as a spin-down mechanism to help you reduce your assets and qualify for Medicaid in anticipation of your future long-term care needs and your Medicaid application. I hope that this information has been helpful to you. If it has, I ask that you like and share with others. And as always, thank you for joining me.